peanut butter and jelly, comedy and tragedy, cats and chaos. Individually, these things are pretty good. Together, they can be amazing. Another of those things is Marvel and Capcom, two halves of the world's most recognizable fighting game series. Just recently, we were treated to the fourth installment of the series, Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite. The game is a bit expensive, but since I really wanted to review it, I decided it was worth the cost. I now owe a debt to the Mafia, but what's the threat of death compared to playing the latest video game?
Someday, and that day may never come, I'll call upon you to do a service for me.
With the addition of a story mode, a series first, Infinite promises to be a content-rich game. We'll be discussing that and more as we examine Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite. A lot of people don't know that the vs. Capcom series of games were inspired by two specific titles, Marvel Superheroes and X-Men Children of the Atom. Both were fantastic fighting games that, back in the arcade days, stole many quarters from enterprising young kids looking to challenge and dominate their friends. Crossover games weren't as common then as they are now. One of the earliest crossover games of note came from Squaresoft and Nintendo with Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars. The combination of two of the biggest gaming companies in the world blew kids' minds back then, and that was only the start of the crossover hype. It wasn't long before arcades were graced with a new fighting game. The title? Marvel vs. Capcom Clash of Superheroes. It integrated some of the biggest names from both sides and placed them in frantic 2-on-2 battles, unheard of in a genre dominated by more traditional one-on-one combat. As if that wasn't enough, there were secret characters to use and special partners who were summoned assistants that weren't playable but could still aid you in different ways. Many avid gamers waited for an inevitable sequel, and on February 24th, 2000, they got it. Marvel vs. Capcom 2, New Age of Heroes, took the concept of its predecessor and injected it with steroids. The first Marvel vs. Capcom game had 15 playable fighters, a number common in fighting games of the time. But Marvel vs. Capcom 2 had an unbelievable 56 playable fighters. What's more, battles were now 3-on-3, creating even more chaos in the game and demanding a greater focus from serious players. This smorgasbord made for one of the greatest and most memorable fighting games of all time, and the future seemed bright for the series. After all, if this kind of improvement could be made in only 2 short years, many can only imagine what the third game could bring. Sadly, fans of the vs. Capcom series of games would have to wait for over a decade for the next installment, but for some the wait was well worth it. In 2011, fighting game fans were treated to Marvel vs. Capcom 3, Fate of Two Worlds. Gone were the traditional sprite work of the first two games in favor of 3D models. It's likely that for this reason, the game has a smaller, but still impressive, roster of 38 playable fighters. It followed its predecessor closely, with chaotic 3-on-3 battles against 3D backgrounds. An upgraded version of the game, Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3, added an extra 12 characters for a final roster of 50. Both versions were popular and relevant for their time, with exceptionally active communities, some of which are still alive even today. This helped make the wait for the next iteration easier, but it would still take 5 long years before it would see release. Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite returns to the series' roots, replacing the famous 3-on-3 battles with 2-on-2, but with the addition of Infinity Gems. This isn't the first fighting game to introduce these items to players. Marvel Superheroes was based on the Infinity Gauntlet storyline in Marvel Comics and allowed players to also utilize the gems. While it was possible for multiple of these gems to be acquired and activated in a single battle in Marvel Superheroes, Infinite only allows a single gem per team, selectable before each battle. Each Infinity Gem offers 2 different benefits, Surges and Storms. Surges are assigned to a specific button, and using them helps charge the meter needed for your second benefit, Infinity Storms. Infinity Storms change the battlefield and offer further advantages to a player for a limited time. The Reality Gem, for example, generates a projectile that tracks opponents for its surge, while creating large and powerful attacks depending on what button you press during its Infinity Storm. The Time Stone gives you a swift dash attack in the direction you're holding for its surge, while its storm allows you to attack much faster, giving access to new combos your fighters can't normally do. The series' traditional tag team mechanics are alive and well here, though the major difference is that you can summon your partner at almost any time. Traditionally, tagging in partners was only allowed when you weren't engaged in combat. This encouraged a careful strategy to avoid unnecessary damage. To be clear, there's still some strategy present here, but the focus has shifted from defensive to offensive. Thanks to the new tagging mechanics, new kinds of combos are possible, so series veterans will find a combination of old and new mechanics here. The idea of who can touch who first is also present here from previous games. Damage dealt is very high for some fighters, so skilled players can deal half health bar or more after a combo, starting with a well-placed hit. But it's difficult to KO from a single touch because the combos scale very heavily the higher they go. In other words, the longer the combo goes, the less damage attacks do. This gives players more chances to turn the game around as opposed to previous games. There are 6 new fighters to the series here, and each one is fairly interesting and fun to play. Mega Man X utilizes special weapons which exist within his origin game. Ultron commands drones and offers tricky grapples. And Gamora is a fast, floaty attacker with lots of options. Many of the old fighters returning from previous games are given at least 1 or 2 new tools. For example, Frank West can set up a camera to more easily level up mid-combo. Hagar grabs an oil drum to block projectiles or throw. And Hulk can now wall jump to get up close and personal with projectile-heavy zoning characters. Finally, the story mode is a new addition to a series that traditionally focused more heavily on fighting the AI in arcade modes or fighting against your friends. It throws together the characters and worlds from Marvel and Capcom, who fight to return their worlds to normal after the two are combined by Ultron Sigma. The story mode does a lot of things right, but also falls flat elsewhere. We'll be discussing more of that later in the review. Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite has a large selection of music. Most of the tracks in the game are there to create a theme for the characters, and those serve as background music regardless of the stage. Many tracks are remixes of music that is iconic to the character they represent. One example is X, whose theme song evokes memories of Mega Man X's intro stage. While his partner Zero remixes his theme from Mega Man X2. Fighters from the Capcom side have themes that feel like they were inspired by trap music or nightcore. While this isn't necessarily bad, it doesn't fit coherently with the themes on Marvel's side, which seem to be remixes of their Marvel Cinematic Universe themes, traditionally orchestrated themes remixed for Infinite. The rest of the music in the game that isn't tied to the characters I consider just okay. It invokes the right emotions and feels appropriate for their placement in the game, though they feel a bit unremarkable. I'm a bit early in the review here to say this, but while Infinite has a large list of tracks, many of them are still very hit and miss. Some tracks sound great, as if that's where the audio budget went to. Other tracks are just awful and not fitting to the character. Many of these don't even fit the game's overall theme on either Capcom or Marvel side. Here's the part of the review where we talk about the game's negative aspects. For starters, the game's playable roster is the most humdrum roster I've ever seen for a fighting game. If the number 6 before new to the series didn't shock you, it should have. Most of the roster is made up of returning characters from Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. Never in the history of the vs. Capcom series have we ever had so few new characters in the sequel, even if we consider the DLC. Speaking of the DLC, 3 of the DLC characters, Black Panther, Monster Hunter, and Sigma, are prominently featured in the game's story mode, yet aren't playable. Why add these characters if you aren't going to let us use them? It seems like a missed opportunity to give us a chance to get a taste for the characters, to help base game purchasers sitting on the fence about it make the decision to buy a season pass. The rest of the roster has no real standout fighters returning from previous games. Normally this might not be a big deal, but since almost the entire roster is returning fighters, there's a bigger emphasis on the selection. If I were to sum up the roster in one word, safe would be that word. The only new character here that's risky is Jedha. I hate to harp on forever about the roster, but I think the single most important aspect to a fighting game is its playable fighters. The Marvel side seems to exist purely to advertise the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and still it doesn't hit all the bases. For example, where's Ant-Man or Wasp? The new Ant-Man movie is coming up next year, yet these two are mysteriously absent from the roster. There's also a complete lack of Fantastic Four and X-Men characters, which can probably be blamed on Marvel and Disney. I delve into the semantics of this, but other videos do this topic justice much better than I can. Capcom's side seems to be whatever they could carry over from Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. The assets are so obviously transferred over that sometimes it seems like they weren't even trying. It's obvious what Capcom can do when they get serious. Mega Man X is a fun character. And Jedha is hilarious. But why are there not more interesting characters? Capcom has no shortage of amazing series to pull from. Where's Breath of Fire? Power Stone? Onimusha? Rival Schools? What happened to Amaterasu and Beautiful Joe? The battlefields are also disappointing. While it's true that you don't focus on the background during a fight, making these interesting is still worth the time and effort. Valkonda and Crossguard have colorful and interesting backgrounds, while the rest are just city streets or one of my personal favorites, a hallway. It's obvious that they only created these stages for use in the story mode, but would it have killed them to add in some extra stages? Imagine a stage that combines Castle Doom and Latveria with the Emperor's Castle and Super Ghouls and Ghosts, complete with Doombots battling iconic ghouls and ghost zombies rising from the ground in coffins. Just imagining it makes the stages in Infinite seem even more boring than they already are. Moving away from the topic of the playable fighters and backgrounds, I thought it best to discuss the actual models of the fighters themselves. Some of the models, like X and Firebrand, look amazing. Others, like Rocket Raccoon and Dante, don't seem to have improved since the demo. Rocket Raccoon looks off. I'm not sure how best to explain it, but if I didn't know any better, I'd say he was suffering. Dante, on the other hand, seems like he's in the early stages of jaundice and took method acting lessons from Patrick Bateman. To be fair, the only time these issues crop up are during the story mode when the models are front and center and the camera gets in close to them. It really rips you out of the story to see just how bad some of these models are. On the topic of story mode, here's where a lot of the bad voice acting comes front and center. Many have voice acting that just doesn't sound right or doesn't seem to fit them at all.
Oh no. Nah, bad idea.
Rocket, what is it?
Seriously? You know who this is, right? Doc, back me up here.
That's not counting that some of the dialogue is hilariously bad. Check out a few of these masterpieces.
Huh? Hey, who's the action figure?
Zero? Zero? No. I am Oblivion. His core routines have been rewritten by the Grandmaster.
X, take the stone.
I don't know. Do I have the right to wield its power? Am I...
Got it. Let's go.
Commander Redfield, did you have something to add? Some great insight?
You're going down, Ultron Sigma.
That's it. Some banal cliche. It's fitting that those would be your final words.
You dare defy me?
Absolutely. Go get him, Frank.
Whoa, whoa, whoa! You want me to go up against him? He's gonna kill me!
Well, they say journalism's a dying profession.
Ready. Fight.
If Marvel and Disney were trying to make it seem like Infinite wasn't just one big advertisement for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they did an awful job. There's several scenarios in the game that harken back to notable events in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, most notably Civil War. And no doubt Spidey's brief brush with the symbiote is there to remind you that the sequel to Spider-Man Homecoming is probably going to involve Venom. It might also serve to remind you that Venom is a DLC fighter. Either way, it was a bad move. I could forgive all that if the story hadn't ended directly on a cliffhanger. The story sees no resolution on almost all of the important plot points presented to the character. With how open the game's story seemed to end, it's almost like they did it on purpose. The implications of a possible story DLC in a game that's already shoving DLC at us is an offense that I just can't ignore. Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite is a game that clearly needed some more time in the oven. There's a lot of good things about it, like the overall gameplay, easy access to concept art, and the upcoming DLC looks somewhat promising. On the other hand, there's a lot of bad too. Some models look bad, the OST is lackluster, most of the battlegrounds are uninspired, the roster is boring and safe. It puts Infinite on this weird middle ground where much of what the game offers is boring or unimaginative, but the core of the game, what you buy the game for, is solid. It's up to you to decide if it's worth the price tag. Well, that's all folks. If you enjoyed the review and want more Chunky Beef, subscribe to me here on YouTube. I'll also have links to my Minds, Twitter, and Twitch pages if you want to follow me and know what I'm streaming. Hope to see you for the next review.